Welcome back, everyone. Just to give you a word of warning, we're experiencing some technical difficulties on this side, as in the whole country is struggling with power. So we're scheduled, some of us at least, are scheduled to flip out at 4 o'clock. The three of us have it under control, hopefully, but I'm going to make Chris and Glenn hosts, co-hosts, just to triangulate around the world. Thank you guys for agreeing a bit closer to the time. Great, so with that said, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Caitlin Rybko, who's our very own ACEP's UJ person, and she'll be telling us about the knowledge machine, Googling and testimony. Go for it, Caitlin.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone see all right? Just checking. Yeah, okay, fantastic. Okay, so here we go. To start with, I just want to lay down a little bit of context before we get into the deep stuff. All right, so Google is just a really important epistemic resource, and it's fundamentally changed how we interact with information. And I'm using that word information here on purpose. It's just not clear that it is knowledge, or at least that it counts as knowledge based on traditional accounts of epistemology. So I really want to just keep it vague for now. Okay, and this is obviously having an effect on how we come to hold beliefs and acquire knowledge, right? And it's just not really clear that the roots of traditional knowledge acquisition apply to online spaces in general, and even less so when the provenance of the information that we're presented with is just so opaque. But this is a very big issue, and we have lots and lots of different epistemic routes to follow here. So my focus is going to be really narrow, and I'm going to be focusing on what Google calls knowledge panels. What are they? How do they work? I'm going to explain that to you in a moment. Okay. So Google's changed a lot since it started, and as its functionality has increased, the more our use of it has changed. And older versions of Google were generally geared towards sorting through vast amounts of information on the web, aiming to direct us to possible sources of information. But as that's changed, so their focus has changed. And they're moving from like indirect to more direct sources. So what's happening here is that we're not just being directed towards possibly good sources of information, we're being shown some of that information directly. And I think that this is quite similar to how we would deal with regular sources of information. We ask a question, we get an answer, right? Moreover, this is happening exceptionally fast. So searches these days take about 0.6 seconds, which means that anytime I want to find anything out, I have a near immediate source for doing so. Okay, so knowledge panels are a direct result of this shift, right? It's this need to get information out really fast and to answer questions posed by users as quickly as possible. You've almost definitely seen them before, but you probably haven't known that they're called knowledge panels, and this is what they look like. You can see here, we get some vague information on epistemology. We've got Karen, our lovely keynote later. Not a lot of information, but enough to give you a vague idea of who she is, right? And we can also see that this information has been scraped from something like Wikipedia, although in this case, we don't have any idea where that information came from. So the important thing to note is that this is all done automatically by a bunch of algorithms that combine the data and then spit it out into these little boxes. I'm not going to be paying a lot of attention to how that really works in this talk. There's lots of theory behind that, but for now, this is what we're dealing with, right? So you can see when I Google something like an actress, or I can Google a city, it'll give me a lot more information. And a lot of the time it's trying to anticipate some of my next questions about any of these things, right? Okay, so what's the problem? Well, here we are. We've got about 6.5 billion searches a day, and that's a lot of inquiry. And about 50% of these searches end on the search page, right? Meaning that people are not clicking out to other pages. So anecdotally speaking, a lot of my searches end like this as well. I want to check something really quickly, so I just Google it, I see my answer, I close the window, and I move on, right? Why is this important? Well, it's just not really clear if knowledge panels can be knowledge producing. When I read something from a knowledge panel, it's not quite like receiving standard testimony from a standard expert or authority, and without being able to determine what sort of epistemic state knowledge panels allow, leaves us unable to adequately diagnose them and their effects on our epistemic ecology. And given the amount of inquiry we undertake every day, I think that we need to pay this a little bit of attention. Okay, so I'm going to be making two claims here. The first is that I'm going to say people are treating knowledge panels as testimony, and it's not really clear that they are or that we ought to be treating them as such. But if we want to understand them, then we at least need to try and figure out how we're interacting with them, epistemically speaking. And in the next section, I'm going to give two prima facie reasons why they get treated as such. Right. Secondly, and I just want to make this quite clear, it doesn't mean that they're any particular sort of testimony. So I'm not adding any kind of value here. It could turn out that they're like really bad testimony or they're really great sources. I don't really know yet, but we need to establish that first, that they're testimonial in nature before we can start figuring out any of that other stuff. Okay, so why should we think that people treat knowledge panels as testimony? Well, firstly, there are lots of possible places for me to get my information, and I tend not to use them, right? Google is very often my first port of call. And remember, Googling is really fast. I can pick up my phone and search. I can open a new tab and do it. I can ask someone to Google it for me, right? There are lots of avenues here. And secondly, it's just really ubiquitous. So when I try and Google something, I tend to do it without thinking. I type in my question, I check the response, and then I move on. And in this way, it's a little bit like checking the time, reading a street sign, right? Meaning that I'm not paying very much attention to what else is going on the page or anything like that. I see it, I have what I need, and because it's presented to me right there, I just take it as it is. Moreover, I don't really treat the whole interface as being cognitively salient, right? We see the information that we're looking for without really thinking about how we're going about it in a similar way to how we might look at like a stop sign, right? And so Gann and Lynch call this cognitively seamlessness, right? So the act of Googling is cognitively seamless, meaning that we see the information that we're seeking without always noticing about how we're going about it. And this process happens so easily, it's not cognitively demanding in any way. So when my answer is presented to me in a nice little box, I'm more likely to take it as it is. I don't check my watch and then question the validity of the time, right? I expect it to be right. And I know that it could be wrong, but that doesn't really stop me from thinking of it as being essentially reliable. And when I read the information in the knowledge panel, I take it as being reliable too. This inherent sense of reliability is what's really important here. I don't check the information that it shows me. In fact, a lot of the time we use Google to check out whether or not someone has said something right or wrong, right? And think of any arguments that you've had with a friend over films or music. Someone says, I'll Google it, and they check it, and we see who's right, and we move on, right? There's a kind of embedded prima facie trust here, but I'm not going to get into that too deeply. So we have our first reason. Google appears to be essentially reliable, right? Moving on. When I Google something, I'm looking for answers. And this means that I want it to give me access to some form of information. So let's say that I want to see how much a cup of flour weighs. I have a bunch of ways to do that, right? I can weigh it myself. I can look it up, not online, perhaps in a cooking book, right? But that's quite easy. So what if I want to do something that's a little bit more complicated, something that I can't measure out myself, right? Let's say I want to see how tall Tom Cruise really is, right? I can't go measure him, unfortunately, but let's say that instead I want to find out something a little bit more obscure on the general knowledge scale. I'm just following my curiosity, and perhaps I want to know something about Gödel's completeness theorem. I'm not a mathematician. I don't really understand a lot of it. And unlike the cup of flour, I can't go and figure it out myself. I don't have any maths textbooks in my house that might explain it to me, and they might even be a bit beyond me. So I could try and find a textbook somewhere else, but that would probably take up a lot of time. And it seems like a lot of effort to go through just to follow a curious whim. And this is exactly what Google's here for, right? So when I Google it, I get this little box, which doesn't give me a huge chunk of information, but it does give me just enough to understand why it is important. So now I have some form of reference for the theorem when I come across it again, or if someone asks me about it, right? And anytime the knowledge panel is giving me a direct answer, it's fulfilling a particular sort of function for me. It's giving me access to particular information that I would otherwise have a much harder time acquiring. And in this way, I think that what's happening is Google and these knowledge panels are acting as a meta expert, right? Why? Well, there are a few definitions for expertise, but typically we can think of experts as having a few conditions. They provide answers and guidance, they are reliable sources of information, and they're helpful to lay people who are not able to execute a task on their own. And while I think that Google can't really hold beliefs because it's not really an agent, it does seem to fulfill these functions quite well. So going back to the mathematical theorem example, we can see that I'm getting a bit of guidance. I'm using what I perceive to be a reliable source of information because that's what they told me. And it's helpful to me, a mathematical layperson who is not able to find that information out by myself. Right. So I'm using the term meta expert here largely because Google can't hold its own beliefs, but it seems to be fulfilling the kind of expertise function in any case. Okay, so we have our second prima facie reason for treating knowledge panels as testimony. Google is a meta expert. So what next? Let's talk some consequences. Let's see what happens if we don't treat knowledge panels as testimony, right? So firstly, I think this is just going to put a lot of our other interactions with testimonial sources in jeopardy, especially where they have lots of parallels. So let's say I look up a weather report because I want to know if it's going to rain this weekend. I'm not really sure what the difference is if I Google it or if I listen to the weather report on the evening news, right? And moreover, I'm not really going to check any of them, right? In both cases, I'm looking for information, and in both it's being given to me. So I don't really treat them differently. And remember, Google has gotten me to think about it as being reliable, so I think of it as a reliable source in the same way that I would think about the news. But let's use another example. If I want to find out who directed the film, I can ask a friend who knows a lot about films, or I could look up the answer on the internet, right? I can read the film's IMDb page, or I can read it from a knowledge panel. And in either way, I'm probably getting the same answer because Google's going to take it straight from IMDb or Wikipedia. So without getting into like deep debates on reductionism or non-reductionism, asking a friend might seem to be more reliable, but they're essentially giving me the same answer. And I think what I'm really going for here is that we get a lot of our information from the internet now, and we tend to treat it as testimony a lot of the time, and sometimes even under more dubious circumstances. So Twitter, for example, has this veneer of extra reliability because they have verified accounts, but those accounts can be easily hacked or they can be faked. And we often don't question what we read on there a lot of the time anyway, and we still might think of it in a kind of testimonial way. So for example, here are some tweets. We can see that two are from official accounts, and they seem to me to be quite clear examples of testimony, so we would probably be justified at treating them as such. And the third example has someone testifying to what they did and providing us with some nice evidence, which further increases our desire to treat it as testimony. But let's look at one other kind of internet source. Let's look at Wikipedia. What I read on a Wikipedia page is often taken as testimony too. And the provenance of that information is sometimes equally opaque as anywhere else on the internet. I don't know the names of any of the editors. I don't know precisely how many people contributed to an entry. And so, oh, I've moved too fast. And so, while I can see some references and sources, how often do you actually check them, right? Especially if you're trying to look up something very quickly. And at first, it seems like there are a lot more checks and balances on Wikipedia, but given that Google gets a lot of its information from Wikipedia, it doesn't seem all that different, especially when I boil it down. So Deborah Tollefson has argued that although testimony has traditionally been viewed as occurring through individuals, Wikipedia can also be a source of testimony as a kind of group testimony. But at the time of her writing, Wikipedia was still rather young, and it has changed just as much as Google has. And in that time, I think we've come to view Wikipedia as being more reliable. And in fairness, I think it's worked quite hard to ensure that. So I think that Google's probably profiting a little bit off of this reliability in the case of knowledge panels, because a lot of them point users towards Wikipedia pages, but that's not always the case. And regardless of that, the same sense of reliability seems to follow over. Finally, I think what's also important to note is that taking knowledge panels as testimony saves us a lot of epistemic energy that I can use elsewhere. If I had to check up everything on everything I wanted to whenever I was following a curious whim, right? And every piece of information I get from the internet, I would be spending a lot of time doing that. And where else would I check for it, right? With information as centralized as it is now, and with everything being essentially digital in nature, questioning sources is good epistemic practice, but I'm left with few places to go if I don't actually want to use Google. And maybe that's its own problem that I'm not going to deal with here. Okay, so I think that the consequences for treating knowledge panels not as testimony are going to be a little bit dire, because it might mean that there's not a lot of information that we see on the internet that can be treated as such either. And if we do start treating them as testimony, then we can probably start talking about their epistemic effects. Not taking them as such is dangerous then, because it leaves us unable to properly determine if they are enough to allow for knowledge to obtain, which they may not be, but it still leaves us without the ability to think about them in an epistemically rigorous way. And I think we'd be losing out. So to wrap up very briefly, there are some good reasons that explain why we treat knowledge panels as testimony. We perceive them to be reliable, they're cognitively salient, and Google acts like a meta expert. All of this stuff combines into us not really thinking about what we're seeing. And we treat other sorts of informational sources in similar sorts of ways. Moreover, right, I often use the information that I find in a knowledge panel, whether it's to know how much a cup of flour weighs, or whether I'm telling a friend about the name of that actor and that film, right, that I've had to look up. I'm sharing that information. And when that happens, it looks like what I'm doing there is I'm using it to testify to others. And that puts my testimony in jeopardy as well. So does this make them testimonial in nature? I'm not sure. But I think that in order to start addressing the epistemic dimensions, we need to actually start treating them as that they are. And once we do this, then we can start talking about whether or not they're good sources of testimony or bad sources of testimony. And in either case, I think that that's epistemically interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.